Meehan was charged with breaching a serious crime prevention order after he failed to tell police he was living in Queensland.
Some people don't fall into power. They grow up around it, watch it closely, and learn how it really works. Allan Meehan was one of those people. Long before the patch, before the title, before police started watching his every move, the direction was already set. This isn't a story about a lucky break or one big moment. It's about how control is built quietly, piece by piece, until suddenly you're the most powerful name in the room. So, was Allan Meehan shaped by the bikie world, or was he always built for it? Miller Made. Allan Meehan grew up in Miller, in Sydney's southwest. It's the kind of place where most people know each other by face, even if they don't know names. You see the same cars, the same groups standing around, the same people coming and going. Nothing really feels private, and news moves fast. He spent his early years there, hanging around the neighborhood, watching how things worked. You noticed quickly who people avoided, who they listened to, and who didn't get messed with. You also noticed who kept getting stopped, who always seemed to be dealing with police, and who learned to stay out of sight when patrol cars came through. Meehan wasn't someone who drew attention to himself. He wasn't the loud one in the group. He didn't feel the need to show off or prove anything. He stayed around long enough to understand how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. He went to Trinity Catholic College in Auburn, but school didn't last. That wasn't unusual. A lot of people he grew up with left early too. Some drifted, some started working, some got caught up in things that pulled them away fast. School just wasn't where life seemed to be happening. Outside school, the street filled that gap. That's where you learned what mattered. You learned who you could trust. You learned that saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could cause problems that didn't go away easily. And you learned that once someone decided you were unreliable, that label stuck. People who knew Meehan back then describe him as steady. He didn't talk too much. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. If he said he'd do something, he did it. That kind of reputation builds quietly, but it builds fast in a place where everyone pays attention. Miller had no shortage of older figures who younger guys watched closely. Some had money. Some had connections. Some had been around long enough that nobody questioned them. You didn't need anyone to explain who mattered. You could tell by how conversations stopped when they walked in, or how people waited for them to speak first. Meehan paid attention to those details. He noticed who lasted and who disappeared. He noticed that the ones who stuck around weren't always the toughest or the angriest. They were the ones who didn't rush, didn't panic, and didn't make emotional decisions. As a teenager, he also learned how quickly things could go wrong. One mistake, one argument, one bad choice, and suddenly people were dealing with court dates, charges, or problems they couldn't walk away from. Watching that happen to others left an impression. He didn't act like someone who thought he was untouchable. Over time, he started spending more time around people who were already involved in serious things. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, it's just being around them, hearing stories, seeing how they move. Eventually, it feels normal. What stood out was that Meehan didn't rush into anything. He didn't jump at opportunities just because they were there. He watched how people handled pressure. He watched who stayed loyal and who folded. Those observations mattered later, even if he didn't realize it yet. By the time outlaw motorcycle clubs entered his life, none of it felt foreign. Hierarchy made sense to him. Loyalty wasn't a slogan, it was something you demonstrated over time. And authority wasn't about shouting or threats, it was about whether people backed you when it counted. Miller didn't give him a blueprint. It didn't point him in a single direction. What it did was teach him how to read people and situations early, long before titles or patches came into the picture. Learning the game early. By the time Meehan was getting older, his life wasn't just about where he lived anymore. It was about who he was around and what he was paying attention to. The neighborhood was familiar, but his awareness was shifting. He started noticing that not everyone moved through the same spaces in the same way, and that some people seemed insulated from problems that caught others quickly. He spent time around people who already had experience in the street world, not in a dramatic way, but through proximity. You'd see the same faces around, hear the same names mentioned, and start to understand who had history and who didn't. Some people talked constantly about what they were involved in. Others barely said anything, yet everyone seemed to know exactly who they were. Meehan paid attention to those differences. He noticed that the people who lasted weren't the ones telling stories or looking for reactions. They were the ones who stayed calm when things went wrong and didn't rush decisions when opportunities came up. Watching that made an impression, especially when he saw how quickly things fell apart for people who acted without thinking. Around this time, he crossed paths with Mark Buddle, who already had a reputation. Buddle wasn't someone who needed to explain himself or advertise who he was. People around him already understood. Meehan was younger and still learning, but there was familiarity between them. Not mentorship, not partnership, just exposure. And exposure matters more than people realize. Being around figures like that showed Meehan how decisions actually get made. There were no big speeches or dramatic moments. Things happened quietly, a word here, a look there, and suddenly everyone knew what direction things were going. He saw how loyalty wasn't tested with speeches, but with pressure, and how people revealed themselves when things became uncomfortable. This period also taught him how fragile most street alliances really are. He watched people panic when police attention increased. He watched others turn on friends the moment things felt risky. Those moments stuck with him. He didn't attach himself to people who couldn't handle stress, and he didn't assume anyone was solid just because they talked confidently. He also became careful about how visible he was, not hiding but not advertising either. He learned that attention doesn't always come when you want it, and once it arrives, it rarely leaves on its own. That awareness separated him from others his age, who treated every moment like something to show off. As his circle narrowed, his reputation quietly improved. People saw him as dependable, someone who didn't create unnecessary problems, someone who listened and remembered what was said. In environments where trust is rare and mistakes are expensive, that kind of consistency travels fast. What's important is that none of this felt rushed. Meehan wasn't trying to jump ahead of where he was. He wasn't chasing status for its own sake. He was learning how people survived long-term and adjusting his behavior accordingly. That patience is what kept him in rooms that others aged out of quickly. By the time outlaw motorcycle clubs became more than just something he saw from the outside, the basics already made sense to him. Hierarchy didn't feel restrictive. It felt familiar. Loyalty wasn't something abstract, it was something you showed through behavior over time. And authority wasn't about volume or threats, it was about whether people trusted you when pressure showed up. This stage of his life didn't turn him into a major figure. It didn't give him power or protection. What it did give him was awareness of people, of risk, and of timing. And that awareness meant that when he finally stepped into a structured organization, he wasn't learning from scratch. Rebels without illusions. When Meehan joined the Rebels Motorcycle Club, it didn't feel like a dramatic shift in his life. By that point, he already understood hierarchy and expectations, so stepping into the club felt more like entering a formal version of things he'd already been around. The Rebels weren't casual about membership, and from the beginning it was clear that being part of the club meant following rules without constant reminders. The club had its own rhythm. Meetings happened when they were supposed to. Orders were given directly, without explanation. If someone failed to do what was expected, it didn't turn into a debate. That kind of structure suited Allan. He didn't need constant supervision, and he didn't need attention to stay motivated. He treated the club like something that required consistency rather than performance. Inside the Rebels, Meehan focused on learning who actually influenced decisions. Titles mattered, but they weren't everything. Some members rarely spoke, yet when they did, people listened. Others talked often, but didn't carry much weight. He watched those dynamics closely and adjusted how he interacted with people based on what he saw rather than what was written on paper. As time went on, he was given more responsibility. Not the kind that brought recognition, but the kind that needed to be handled properly to avoid problems. He took those responsibilities seriously and didn't look for shortcuts. That approach built trust, especially among members who were used to dealing with people who caused unnecessary complications. People inside the club started seeing him as organized and dependable. He wasn't aggressive in how he led, but he was firm about expectations. If something needed to be done, it got done. If someone crossed a line, it was addressed without escalation. That consistency made him useful in situations where instability could easily turn into conflict. Eventually, Meehan became president of the Kernel chapter. That role came with pressure that wasn't visible from the outside. Chapter presidents are responsible for keeping members disciplined, managing internal issues, and making sure problems don't attract attention beyond the club. It's a position where mistakes are noticed quickly and remembered for a long time. He handled that role the same way he handled everything else. He didn't rely on threats or constant reminders of authority. People knew what was expected of them, and they knew that failing to meet those expectations would have consequences. That approach kept things steady, which mattered more than noise or intimidation. During this time, Meehan also spent time around established families within the rebels. Those relationships came with an unspoken understanding that family connections carried weight no matter what titles were held. He didn't challenge that reality, but he didn't ignore it either. He paid attention to how decisions shifted when certain people were involved and how some conversations happened without wider input. That awareness didn't create immediate conflict, but it did shape how he saw his position. He could see that no matter how reliable or capable someone was, certain limits existed. Advancement wasn't only about performance, it was also about who you were connected to and how long those connections had existed. From the outside, his position looked stable and secure. He had rank, responsibility, and backing within the club. There was no outward sign that anything was wrong, but being inside the structure long enough gave him a clear picture of where influence stalled and where it flowed freely. That understanding didn't lead to impulsive decisions. Meehan stayed where he was and continued doing what was expected of him. But the idea that movement had limits stayed with him. Once someone recognizes that, it changes how they think about their future, even if they don't act on it right away. Royal blood and street politics. In the rebels, Meehan had a position people respected. He'd put in time, he was running a chapter, and he wasn't the type to create headaches for everyone else. But once you're in a club long enough, you start noticing something that doesn't show up on paper. There's what the structure says, and then there's what actually happens. Who gets heard, who gets backed, who gets forgiven when they slip up, and who gets watched the moment they make one small mistake. That's where family names come in, and the V family was one of the biggest ones. You don't need someone to sit you down and explain it. You just see it. You see how people act when certain guys walk in. You see who gets greeted first. You see who can speak without getting cut off. It's not always loud, and it's not always aggressive. It's just there, like a rule everyone already knows. Meehan spent time around that circle, especially around Jesse V. Being close to people like that is a good sign, because it means you're trusted enough to be around them. But it also comes with a line you can't pretend doesn't exist. You can be respected and still not be one of them. You can do everything right and still feel that some doors open easier for other people. And once you notice that, it changes how you read everything. When a decision goes a certain way, you start asking yourself if it went that way because it was the smartest call, or because it kept certain people happy. When someone makes a mistake and nothing happens to them, you notice that too. You start seeing the difference between being valued and being protected. Those are two different things. Meehan wasn't the kind of person to react emotionally to that. He didn't start arguments, and he didn't start acting out like he had something to prove. He stayed steady, did his job, and kept his people under control. But he was paying attention, and you can't pay attention like that without thinking about where it leaves you later on. Because running a chapter is one thing, moving higher than that is different. At that level, it's less about whether you can do the work and more about whether you fit into the inner circle that already exists. And if you're not tied in by blood or old history, you have to be realistic about how far you can go without someone opening the gate for you. At the same time, Meehan still had connections outside the rebels' world. He didn't suddenly forget everyone he knew before he got a patch. He'd been around long enough to know people overlap, people talk, and the same names keep coming up in different places. Those outside connections matter because they give you options. and options change how you think. If you only have one path, you accept whatever ceiling comes with it. If you have more than one path, you start weighing them. So even though things looked stable on the surface, he was likely doing what smart people in that position do. He was watching where power was moving, not where it used to be. He was noticing who was rising, who was getting squeezed, who was getting backed, and who was being quietly boxed out. And he was doing it without making a show of it. This is the part people miss when they reduce everything to ego. They assume someone changes direction because they're angry or impatient. Sometimes it's much simpler than that. Sometimes you just realize you're doing everything right, and the system still has a limit for you, not because you're weak, but because you're not tied into the right history. By the end of this phase, Meehan still had respect inside the rebels, and he still had a position that most people would protect. But he also had a clearer picture of what the next step would take, and whether that next step was even available to him in that club. That kind of clarity doesn't force a decision instantly, but it plants the question in your head, and once that question is planted, you don't really stop thinking about it. The patch that changed everything.
Police put Meehan on a serious crime prevention order last year, placing major restrictions on where he can travel and who he can associate with.
Almost immediately after that order was taken out.
By the time Meehan started thinking seriously about leaving the rebels, it wasn't because anything had blown up. There was no public fallout, no argument that forced his hand, and no sudden betrayal that pushed him out. From the outside, his position still looked solid. Inside, though, he was doing what he'd always done, watching closely and weighing options. Switching clubs isn't something people take lightly. Everyone in that world knows what it means. A patch isn't just a logo on a vest. It's a declaration of loyalty, and once it's on, it's meant to stay there. People who change sides usually do it badly or impulsively, and that's why it often ends violently. Meehan knew those stories well. He'd seen how quickly a bad move could erase years of work. That's why his decision didn't come fast. It took time. And it took conversations that didn't happen in public. He wasn't looking for a dramatic exit or a statement. He was thinking about where influence actually sat and how much room there was to move within the structure he was in. From his point of view, staying where he was meant accepting limits that weren't going to change. What made the decision even riskier was the destination. The Comanchero Motorcycle Club weren't just another club. They had their own history, their own rivalries, and their own expectation. Patching over into the Comancheros meant more than leaving the rebels. It meant stepping directly into a different power structure and trusting that the people on the other side would stand by him once the move was made. That kind of trust doesn't come from a single conversation. It comes from relationships built long before anyone talks about switching patches. Meehan had those relationships. He'd spent years keeping connections alive outside his own club, staying in touch with people who mattered and not burning bridges he might need later. When the time came to move, he wasn't walking into the unknown. Still, once the decision was made, there was no middle ground. You don't half leave a club. You either stay loyal or you don't. Meehan patched over fully, and from that moment on, everything around him changed. Old alliances were tested. People who'd once backed him had to decide whether to keep contact or cut it off. And anyone watching from the outside immediately understood how serious the move was. What's important is that nothing exploded right away. There wasn't an immediate response that played out in public. That doesn't mean the risk disappeared. It means the calculation behind the move had been solid enough to prevent instant retaliation. In a world where overreaction is common, silence can be just as telling as violence. Inside the Comancheros, Meehan didn't come in acting like an outsider who needed to prove himself. He treated it like he treated everything else: learn the structure, understand who holds influence, and stay consistent. He didn't assume past rank carried over automatically. He let his behavior speak first. People inside the club were watching him closely. A patchover always raises questions. Who does this guy answer to now? What does he bring with him? Can he be trusted long-term? Meehan handled that scrutiny the same way he handled pressure everywhere else. He didn't rush, didn't talk too much, and didn't create unnecessary noise. Over time, it became clear that the move hadn't weakened him. If anything, it put him closer to where decisions were being made. The Comancheros were structured differently. and there was more room for someone who understood organization and control. That didn't mean everything was smooth, but it did mean the ceiling felt higher. For people watching from the outside, the patchover sent a clear message. Meehan wasn't someone acting on impulse. He was willing to take a serious risk if it meant changing his long-term position. In a world where most people cling to what they have until it collapses, that stood out. This phase of his life wasn't loud, but it was decisive. He'd crossed a line that most people never do, and he'd done it without losing his footing. Whatever came next, it would be shaped by that decision, because once you prove you're willing to walk away from one structure, everyone starts paying closer attention to what you build in the next one. And inside the Comancheros, that attention didn't take long to turn into opportunity. Prison years.
Stunned passengers forced aside as the handcuffed and heavily tattooed national president of the Comancheros Outlaw Motorcycle Club was marched past.
Meehan went to prison on a firearms charge and served time between 2014 and 2016. The charge related to possession of a pistol, and the sentence meant he was removed from the scene for roughly 2 years. During that time, he was not active in club affairs and did not hold any public-facing position. While he was inside, life in the bikie world continued without pause. Clubs kept operating, chapters kept running, and internal changes still happened. People moved interstate. Some members fell out with leadership, others gained standing. Police pressure on outlaw motorcycle clubs also continued to increase during that period. Meehan did not attempt to stay involved while he was inside. There were no reported efforts to direct activity or influence decisions from prison. He served his sentence quietly and did not become involved in incidents that drew attention. His name did not surface in connection with disputes or problems during that time. Outside prison, people took note of that absence. In this world, being locked up does not automatically weaken someone's position, but causing trouble while locked up often does. In Allan Mee's case, there were no issues for others to manage on his behalf. His absence did not create additional work or risk for anyone else. When he was released in 2016, there was no period where he had to reintroduce himself. He returned to the same circles and resumed contact with the same people. Conversations continued without hesitation. There was no public questioning of where he stood or whether he still belonged. At the same time, the environment he returned to was not the same one he had left. Pressure on outlaw motorcycle clubs had increased, and internal politics had shifted. Some figures who had been active before his sentence were no longer in the picture. Others had lost influence or moved elsewhere. Meehan did not rush to make moves when he returned. He did not try to assert authority or announce his presence. He spent time reconnecting and re-establishing routine. People around him observed that he had not returned reckless or impatient. Over the next few years, his involvement inside the Comanchero Motorcycle Club increased again. He took on responsibilities gradually and without attention. His name continued to come up in connection with organization and control rather than conflict or escalation. By the late 2010 seconds, Meehan was once again in a position where people trusted him to handle things without drawing focus. That trust was based on consistency rather than recent activity. His time in prison had not disrupted his relationships or standing in a way that required repair. This period is important because it explains why his later rise did not come out of nowhere for people inside the scene. From the outside, his name seemed to appear suddenly in senior positions. Internally, he had already been present, connected, and trusted again for several years. His prison sentence did not elevate him, and it did not sideline him. It simply removed him temporarily, while the rest of the environment changed around him. When he returned, he stepped back into a space that had fewer stable figures than before. By the time larger opportunities began to appear, Meehan was already active, already known, and already considered reliable. He did not need to rebuild momentum, because it had not disappeared while he was inside. That context matters going into what happened next, because when leadership gaps opened, he was not stepping forward from the sidelines. He was already there. A death that opened the door. In July 2020, a fight broke out at Kokomo's nightclub in Canberra. It wasn't planned, and it didn't start as anything unusual. Groups were drinking, tempers were up, and things escalated quickly. These kinds of situations happen often enough, but this one didn't end the way most of them do. Peter Soni Uvalu, a senior figure in the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, was there with friends. According to accounts later given in court, he was trying to calm things down when another man came up behind him and stabbed him in the neck. After being stabbed, Uvalu managed to make it outside before collapsing. He died at the scene. The incident didn't stay contained inside the club. It was caught on CCTV, and parts of it were recorded on mobile phones by people who were there. Within hours, the footage was circulating among police and others who paid attention to that world. What might have once stayed quiet was now documented from multiple angles. The man responsible, Frederick Tua, was arrested not long after. He later pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 10 years. Another man involved in the brawl, Max Budak, was also charged and sentenced on related offences. The legal side of it moved forward, but the internal consequences had already started. Uvalu's death created a gap that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just another member. He held authority, and his absence left questions that needed answers quickly. In clubs like the Comancheros, uncertainty is dangerous. If leadership isn't clear, people start testing boundaries. That's when problems multiply. At the Canberra chapter level, things needed to be stabilized. Someone had to step in and take control of day-to-day operations, keep members in line, and prevent the fallout from spreading. Someone had to step in and take control of day-to-day operations, keep members in line, and prevent the fallout from spreading. This wasn't about replacing Uvalu personally, it was about making sure the chapter didn't drift while everyone was watching. Meehan was in position when that happened. He already had standing inside the club, and he had experience running people without creating noise. That mattered more than anything else at that moment. The priority wasn't image or status, it was control. He didn't make a show of stepping up. There were no public statements and no gestures meant for outside attention. Inside the club, though, the shift was clear. He took on more responsibility, and people followed his lead. That's how these transitions usually work. If someone has to announce authority, it's already a problem. Police were watching closely as well. A violent death tied to an outlaw club always brings attention, and this one came with video evidence and public interest. Every move made afterward was being observed. That made stability even more important, because mistakes would be noticed immediately. For Allan Mee, this period wasn't about ambition. It was about handling what was in front of him. He focused on keeping things orderly and preventing further issues from spilling out. That approach didn't draw headlines, but it did what it needed to do. Inside the Comancheros, people saw who could operate under pressure and who couldn't. Moments like this tend to sort that out quickly. Some people react emotionally, others freeze. The ones who keep things moving usually end up with more influence afterward, whether they asked for it or not. Uvalu's death didn't start a war, but it did change the internal balance. Roles shifted, expectations changed, and people who had previously been operating at one level found themselves being relied on more heavily. Meehan was one of them. That moment didn't make him a national figure yet, but it moved him closer to where bigger decisions were being made. In a world where advancement often comes from chaos rather than planning, this was one of those turning points that only make sense after the fact. And once that door opened, it didn't close again. The Canberra promotion. After Peter Sony Uvalu was killed in July 2020, the Canberra chapter of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club was left without clear leadership. That kind of gap doesn't stay open for long. When a senior figure is removed suddenly, the immediate concern isn't status or rank, it's control. Someone has to step in to keep day-to-day matters running and stop problems from spreading. At that point, Meehan was already active again and known to people inside the club. He had experience running a chapter, and he had a track record of keeping things steady. That combination mattered. In moments like this, clubs don't look for someone loud or symbolic. They look for someone who can handle routine pressure without creating new issues. In early 2021, Meehan was promoted to commander of the Canberra region chapter. The decision wasn't framed publicly, and there was no announcement meant for the outside world. Inside the club, though, it was understood. He was now responsible for overseeing operations in a chapter that had just gone through a violent incident and was under increased attention. The role came with practical responsibilities. He had to deal with internal discipline, maintain order, and make sure the chapter didn't fracture in the aftermath of Uvalu's death. Canberra is smaller than Sydney or Melbourne, which means problems travel faster and are harder to contain. Any misstep would have been noticed quickly. Police attention was already high. The stabbing at Kokomo's nightclub had been captured on CCTV, and the case moved through the courts with public interest. That meant every action taken by the club afterward was being watched more closely than usual. The priority was to avoid further incidents that would draw attention back to the chapter. Meehan approached the role the same way he approached previous responsibilities. He didn't try to change how things worked overnight, and he didn't make a point of being visible. He focused on keeping routines in place and making sure expectations were followed. That approach reduced the chances of internal disputes spilling out. Within the club, people took note of how the transition was handled. There was no open challenge to his position and no sign of instability. That mattered, because leadership changes after violence often trigger power struggles. In this case, things stayed contained. At the same time, the promotion put Meehan closer to the center of decision-making. Being responsible for a region meant dealing with issues beyond a single chapter and coordinating with other parts of the club. It also meant being exposed to more scrutiny, both from within the organization and from law enforcement. During this period, the Comancheros were dealing with broader pressure across multiple states. Police operations targeting outlaw motorcycle clubs were becoming more frequent, and internal movement between chapters was being monitored more closely. Anyone in a leadership role had to be careful about how they operated. Meehan didn't use the Canberra position to push his profile. He didn't seek attention or attempt to leverage the role publicly. His focus stayed on keeping things functional. That approach didn't generate headlines, but it kept problems from escalating. Over time, it became clear that the chapter had stabilized. There were no further violent incidents tied to internal disputes, and no visible fractures that suggested leadership was being questioned. Inside the club, that counted as success. The Canberra promotion didn't make Meehan a national figure on its own, but it did change how he was viewed internally. He had been trusted with a chapter that needed steady control and had managed it without creating new problems. That placed him in a smaller group of people considered capable of handling larger responsibility. As other changes began unfolding inside the Comancheros, that track record stayed with him. When conversations turned to who could step into bigger roles, his name was already part of that discussion. Not because he pushed it there, but because he had already been tested in a difficult situation and had kept things from falling apart. That promotion set the stage for what followed, not as a sudden leap, but as a continuation of responsibility that had already been proven. Crowned without a vote. In 2022, leadership inside the Comanchero Motorcycle Club changed at the national level. The previous national president, Melbourne-based Bikie Mick Murray, was arrested in late April and charged over an alleged execution-style shooting that had taken place in 2019. Once that arrest happened, the top position inside the club was no longer stable. When a national president is removed suddenly, there isn't a long transition period. Clubs don't hold open elections or public discussions. Decisions happen quietly, and they happen fast. The focus is on continuity. Someone has to step in who already understands how things work across states and who won't create uncertainty. By that point, Meehan was already in the frame. He had run a chapter, handled a region, and done it during a period when police pressure was increasing. His name wasn't new to senior figures, and he wasn't seen as someone who needed time to adjust. That mattered more than seniority on paper. The decision to elevate him didn't come with ceremony. There was no internal vote that people outside the club would recognize. Within the organization, though, it was clear. Meehan was now the national president. Authority shifted, and people adjusted accordingly. Being national president isn't about running day-to-day business everywhere. It's about oversight, coordination, and keeping disputes from turning into open conflict. It also means dealing with issues that cut across state lines, including discipline, movement between chapters, and relationships with other groups. At the time Meehan stepped into the role, the club was dealing with pressure on multiple fronts. Police attention was high, and several members were already facing charges in different jurisdictions. Any misstep at the top would have been magnified quickly. Meehan didn't approach the role by trying to assert himself publicly. He didn't go on a media tour or make statements meant for outside audiences. Internally, however, the shift was clear. Communication lines ran through him, and decisions at the national level now carried his authority. People inside the club noted that there wasn't immediate resistance. No chapter openly pushed back. No alternative leadership emerged. That kind of quiet acceptance is often how real power changes hands in this world. If someone has to fight for the position, it usually means they weren't the right choice. Shortly after taking the role, Meehan acknowledged the position publicly in the way Bikie leaders often do now. He posted an image online showing his patch with the national president title. The message wasn't aimed at the general public. It was meant for people who already knew what it signified. Around the same time, he also began appearing more openly in photos connected to the club. Custom motorcycles, club colors, and group images started circulating online. This wasn't unusual behavior for a national president, but it did make his position visible to police and rival groups. That visibility came with risk. Holding the top role meant increased scrutiny, and everyone involved understood that. The difference now was that Meehan was no longer just responsible for his own actions. Decisions he made could affect chapters and members across the country. Inside the club, expectations shifted. Issues that would once have been handled locally now required national approval. Disputes between chapters were brought higher up. That placed more pressure on leadership to keep things contained and predictable. Despite that, there were no immediate signs of instability following the change. Chapters continued operating, and internal routines stayed in place. From the outside, the transition looked uneventful. From the inside, it marked a clear change in who held final authority. Allan Mee's rise to national president didn't come from a single dramatic move. It came from being in the right position when the top role opened and having a record that made the decision easy. There was no campaign and no contest. The position shifted, and he stepped into it. By mid-2022, he was the most senior figure inside the Comancheros. That didn't make him untouchable, but it did put him squarely in the sights of law enforcement. Holding that title meant every move would now be examined more closely than before. What followed wasn't immediate conflict or collapse. It was pressure, applied steadily from the outside. And that pressure would soon begin shaping how the rest of his time at the top unfolded. Being seen. After Meehan became national president of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, he did not keep the role private. His position was shown openly, mainly through social media. There was no attempt to explain it or soften it. The images spoke for themselves. One of the first posts showed his club cut with the national president patch clearly visible. There was no caption explaining the change. For people inside the Bikie world, none was needed. A patch like that is a statement on its own. Once it's shown, the message is already out. After that, more photos began circulating. Some showed him around club members. Others showed motorcycles tied to the club. One post featured a custom-built Harley-Davidson V-Rod in Comanchero colors. Reports at the time put the value of the bike close to $100,000. The post didn't explain where it came from or why it was being shown. It was simply there. Other images showed Meehan outside club settings. He appeared on boats near Sydney Harbour, sometimes with his wife, dressed casually but in high-end designer clothing. Brands like Versace, Balenciaga, and Armani were visible. The posts weren't promotional and they weren't framed as statements. They were just shared. He was also photographed with other senior Comanchero figures. Group photos appeared, showing him alongside people already known to police and to rival clubs. These weren't rare or accidental moments. They were clear and repeated appearances. Nothing about these posts suggested caution. He didn't blur faces, limit visibility, or avoid being identified. His accounts showed who he was with and where he was, often in real time. Anyone paying attention could follow it easily. Inside the club, this wasn't unexpected. Members already knew who held the top role. The posts didn't change internal dynamics. They simply matched what people already understood. Outside the club, the effect was different. Police were able to see associations clearly. Movements became easier to track. Assets were visible. The role of national president was no longer something that existed only in intelligence files. It was being displayed publicly. Despite that, the posts continued. There was no sign that Meehan was trying to pull back or reduce exposure. He didn't go quiet, and he didn't shift to private channels. The visibility stayed consistent. During this period, there were no new charges tied directly to what he posted. No immediate action followed, but attention increased. Police began focusing more closely on him rather than spreading resources across multiple figures. This was a change from earlier years, when he had been one of several senior names. Now, his position and visibility made him the obvious focal point. That didn't happen because of a single post. It happened because of repetition. By the end of this phase, Meehan was one of the most visible Bikie figures in the country. His role, his associations, and his lifestyle were no longer difficult to identify. That visibility did not stop him from operating, but it did narrow the space he had to move freely. What followed was not a sudden arrest or public confrontation. Instead, it was a controlled response, built around restriction rather than charges. That shift would define the next stage of his time at the top. The state pushes back. Not long after Meehan became national president of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, attention from police narrowed around him. This wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic. It followed a familiar pattern. When one person sits at the top, pressure tends to move upward as well. In New South Wales, police began preparing a different kind of response. Rather than waiting for new charges, they moved toward restriction. The goal wasn't to arrest him immediately. It was to limit how he could operate day to day and make it harder for him to stay connected to other figures. In mid-2022, officers attended his home and served him with a serious crime prevention order. The order didn't accuse him of a new offense. It set conditions. From that point on, his movements, associations, and finances were placed under direct control. Under the order, Meehan was banned from associating with known Bikie members and other crime figures. He was required to live at a nominated address in New South Wales and notify police in advance if he planned to stay anywhere else overnight. Travel wasn't prohibited, but it was monitored. His finances were also restricted. He was limited to a single bank account and one credit and debit card. He was not allowed to hold more than $10,000 in cash. Use of encrypted communication devices was prohibited, and police were entitled to inspect his phone. Vehicles were included as well. He had to provide details of any private vehicles he owned. If he used a taxi or rideshare service, he was required to report the number plate and destination within 24 hours. The order covered everyday activity, not just major movements. The message from police was clear. Holding the top role inside a Bikie club came with constant oversight. The order didn't stop him from being national president in name, but it made acting in that role more difficult. Police were open about their reasoning. Senior officers described him as a priority target and said the order was intended to disrupt organized crime at the leadership level. Rather than chasing multiple members, the focus was placed on restricting one person. For Allan, the order changed how he could move immediately. Casual contact became a risk. Routine meetings became harder to arrange. Simple decisions now required notice and compliance. Any mistake could lead to arrest. Despite that, he did not step down right away. The title remained, and the club continued operating. Internally, people adjusted. Communication routes changed. Responsibilities were spread differently. The structure bent, but it did not collapse. At the same time, the pressure created by the order began to show. Living under constant reporting requirements leaves little room for error. Every movement is logged. Every interaction carries risk. Police were watching closely for any breach. Publicly, there was little reaction. Meehan did not give statements and did not respond through media. The order spoke for itself. It signaled that the state had shifted from observation to control. Inside the Bikie world, the order was read as a warning. It wasn't just about one person. It was about what could happen to anyone who stepped into the top role. Leadership now came with formal restrictions, not just informal attention. The situation remained tense but quiet. There were no immediate arrests tied to the order, and no sudden breakdown inside the club. But the space Meehan had to operate freely was shrinking. That pressure did not resolve itself. It built steadily, day by day, waiting for a misstep, and in a system designed around restriction, even small errors can carry consequences. Those consequences would arrive the following year, and they would test how long he could remain at the top under that level of control. Crossing the line. In early 2023, police alleged that Meehan had breached the serious crime prevention order placed on him the year before. The allegation wasn't about violence or new criminal activity. It was about compliance. According to police, the conditions had not been followed as required. On the 9th of February 2023, police arrested Meehan during an early morning operation on the Gold Coast. The arrest was carried out on an outstanding warrant issued in New South Wales. At the time, he was staying in Queensland with his wife and child. Police claimed he had failed to provide full details of his temporary accommodation, had not given an intended return date to his nominated residence, and had possessed and used a communication device with encrypted messaging capabilities. Those alleged breaches were enough to trigger arrest under the order. After the arrest, he was taken before the Southport Magistrates Court. During the hearing, prosecutors argued that the order was clear and that the conditions had been explained. They opposed bail and pushed for him to be returned to New South Wales. His defense was handled by Angus Edwards, who told the court that his client was not attempting to flee. The court heard that the move to Queensland had been made for safety reasons. Police had allegedly warned that there was a $3 million contract on his life, and the relocation was presented as a response to that threat. The defense also pointed out that 12 months of rent had been paid in advance, and that his child had been enrolled at a local school. Those details were raised to show that the move was not temporary or deceptive. Despite that, police maintained that the reporting requirements had not been met. Bail was refused at that stage. Meehan was extradited back to New South Wales to face the charges linked to the alleged breaches. The order that had been designed to restrict his movement was now the center of the case against him. Once back in New South Wales, a further bail application was made. This time, the matter was heard by the Supreme Court. After considering submissions from both sides, the court granted bail set at $150,000 with strict conditions attached. The case moved forward toward trial. In July 2023, Meehan appeared in court again, this time to face 4 charges related to breaching the serious crime prevention order. Outside court, he spoke briefly to media, saying he felt confident about the upcoming hearing. During proceedings, negotiations took place between his legal team and prosecutors. As a result, the matter shifted. Meehan agreed to plead guilty to 1 combined breach charge. The remaining 3 charges were withdrawn by police. On the 6th of July 2023, the court delivered its decision. He avoided a prison sentence. Instead, he was fined $5,000 and placed on a 2-year community correction order. The outcome meant he remained in the community, but under continued supervision. Following the case, Meehan stood down from his position as national president of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club. The decision wasn't framed publicly as an admission or defeat. It was a change that followed the legal outcome and the pressure that came with it. With the top role now vacant, attention inside the club shifted quickly to who would take over. Leadership at that level doesn't stay open for long. Others were already positioning themselves, and the internal balance began adjusting again. The order that had been meant to restrict him had ultimately led to his removal from the top position, not through new criminal charges, but through compliance failures. It marked the end of his time as national president and set the stage for the next change inside the club's leadership. Some people drift into this life. Others are shaped by it early, whether they realize it or not. Allan didn't wake up one day and decide to become a bikie boss. The direction was already there, long before anyone outside was paying attention. The places he grew up, the people he watched, the way he learned to move quietly while others made noise, it all added up over time. This isn't a story about a single crime or a sudden rise. It's about how power forms when no one's looking, and how dangerous it becomes once everyone finally is. So was Allan always headed for the top? Or was the system around him slowly building something it wouldn't know how to control?